So I've always been very clear, but I think we're coming up to that moment now where Starmer has to put up or shut up. Because I am very on the edge of Starmer. Yes, he does absolutely fantastic work currently in the House of Commons, holding Boris and the government to account for their actions. Yes, excellent, very good. However, I have said continuously that sooner or later he needs to put out what his future for, you know, Britain really is. He needs to put that out, and that includes putting policy out. And I've said I understand both sides of this argument, but sooner or later he has to put something out. He has to start putting policy out saying this is what a Labour government will do. This is what a Labour government led by Britain will look like. So today we are going to go over one of those arguments that's basically saying it's time Starmer actually started to put out some policies and what that future Labour government actually looks like. So, before we get into that, please remember to hit that like and share button, and of course down below there is a link to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link, and thank you very much to the people that do support me that way. So, on into this. This comes from The Guardian, and the title is Decent, Competent and Cautious, but Starmer still has to prove he can inspire victory. And this is all part of it. If Starmer cannot prove that he can inspire victory after the next general election, he needs to stand down. I'm sorry, but if Starmer loses, then potentially I think there's justification that he has to stand down. And I know that will upset a lot of people, but sometimes you might only get one shot at these things, and Starmer is in a position, a fantastic position, to take that shot, probably even better than any other, Labour leader in recent times, but he has to take that shot, and that includes taking risks, and sometimes you cannot afford to be cautious in politics. So, let's get into this then. So, after grief comes time to heal. After loss comes acceptance. And even after, the massive divorce on a willingness to move eventually comes on. But it's not something that can be rushed, as Keir Starmer is discovering. However long we have known it, it was coming. Britain's final breakup with the EU still feels like a bereavement for some. Yet, there was no time for mourning in the Labour Party. A ticking parliamentary clock forced the opposition to choose between voting for the only form of Brexit deal available or taking the electoral consequences. By asking his party to back the deal, Starmer was in effect inviting a grieving widow to move on with the body even barely cold. A revolt in Parliament reached beyond the usual suspects, despite some bruising and arm twisting outside it. Many neutral Starmer supporters are dismayed. What happened to the hero of the battle for a second referendum? The man who said that he'd argue for a return of freedom of movement. No, now Labour's position seems to be that there's no use crying over spilt milk. Starmer would not, he confirmed, seek to rewrite the deal if he gains office. For some, that was more shocking than the vote itself. Laura Parker, and former Momentum coordinator turned Starmer cheerleader, tweeted that she was, quote, beyond words, but others have plenty to talk about. It's all tactics, no strategy, says one senior Labour MP. Keir and his people are not political, and they're making increasing missteps because they don't have an analysis about where they ultimately want to go. Yet, as with Labour's decision to expel Jeremy Corbyn over his response to damning findings on anti-Semitism, what the party finds painful or perplexing is often a whole lot easier for the electorate. After 4 interminable years of arguing over Brexit, too many people have simply had a bellyful. An opinion poll finds that Remainers wanted MPs to vote for the deal by a margin of 50% to 90%, with Labour voters split along similar lines. Second, Even some will have been motivated by fear of a no deal. But instead, the Tories' promises to, quote, just get Brexit done also resonated with people sick of living with uncertainty or just simply even beyond caring. And they may soon start to care very much, of course, if their own lives are upended by the unfurling economic consequences, and at best will face years of haggling over issues left unresolved by this skeletal agreement. Britain can no more simply agree to, quote, move on from that than from the pandemic. But that's not quite what Starmer meant. Labour will have the bones to pick, but as his shadow cabinet Rachel Reeves said in closing the debate, the aim is to stop reigniting the past and start thinking about tomorrow. To deal with reality as it is, not brood on what might have been. Her boss seeks to move on less from Europe than from the endless decisions and toxic ghosts of his party's recent past. But the question is, move on to what exactly? When Deborah Mutson, the Britain Think pollster, who deep dives into leave-leaning areas are read increasingly closely, are sent increasingly closely to the leader's office, and asks her focus groups last year which animal Boris Johnson resembles, the answer was a sheep. Voters saw him as hapless, and herded first this way and that, always with someone nipping at his heels. But Starmer was described as an eagle, circling high in the sky. That beats a stinking sheep, obviously. Eagles are powerful birds, but they're also seen as remote and calculating, hovering perpetually out of reach. And who could know what an eagle really thinks? And therein lies his problem. It's a rookie mistake to confuse political pragmatism or the willingness to do what is necessary to win with absence of conviction, as Tony Blair used to joke. When urged to drop all that stuff he had said just to get elected, he'd explained that it was worse than that. He'd actually believed it. He didn't ditch his clause 4 or seek to reform education because it polled well, but because those were generally his instincts. Sometimes, especially on Europe, he was and is the opposite of pragmatic. But where Blair did compromise with the electorate is usually for a reason. Pragmatism with purpose, securing consent in return for clearly identified progressive gains. He could, at least in the early days, lead the party beyond its comfort zone by convincing them the journey would be worth it. But we don't know yet what Starmer burns to change, what drives him, what excites him, but what also sets him apart from anyone else in contemporary politics. Nobody except a full-blown manifesto. He must now develop at least one idea that defines him for voters, shows his party that uncomfortable compromises do lead somewhere worth going, and that it is recognisably something that Boris Johnson would not do. The latter has always struggled to identify what Brexit is for exactly. We know he wants to be free, but what he plans to do with that freedom is more of a mystery. Starmer's issue is what he obviously wants to win, but not what that victory might actually be for. So was voting for Brexit a real winning move? His willingness to swallow what the SNP MP Kirk Blackmore calls this steaming mug of excrement will hurt Labour in Scotland, but help in leave voting northern towns it's desperate to regain from the Tories. Focus group work in those red wall seats concluded that to win them back, Labour had to show and recognise that Leave had won. Even abstaining would have looked too eagle-like, always circling, never actually landing. Starmer's choice looks very much like that of someone expecting to be judged chiefly by this May's bumper local elections on progress in red wall areas. He may well find it harder now to criticise any future fallout from Brexit, and with the Tories bound to crow that he's also what he's voted for. Some Labour rebels will even see echoes of what went on in Iraq, where the Liberal Democrats ultimately benefited from a brave but initially unpopular decision to oppose it from the start. If one day the country comes to decide this claim was a terrible was a terrible mistake, Labour can hardly claim to have said so all along. The blunt truth, however, is that day may not come. The hideous economic fallout from COVID will make it harder to identify any distinct impact from Brexit, and Leave voters have a powerful incentive not to look too hard, given this is something they chose for themselves, against all advice from the entire political establishment at the time. Perhaps the most pragmatic argument for accepting defeat over Brexit, though, is that once Starmer tactically doesn't advance, that the war was actually lost a year ago when Jeremy Corbyn led the party to a thumping defeat, giving Johnson a fat majority for whatever deal he wanted. And when the deal finally landed, Corbyn himself abstained. It is too easy to forget how far Labour has come in just a single year. Starmer has built a reputation for decency and competence, and his personal approval ratings are now even Trump Johnson, even among the Red Wall voters. His cautious approach to the pandemic has built bridges with older voters too, who tend to be pro-lockdown, having lagged about 23 points behind the Tories when Starmer took over in April. Labour is now consistently level pegging, yet that no longer feels quite enough, with some MPs concerned that Johnson may finally be starting to get his act together after a disastrous year. The no deal has been avoided, and Downing Street is calmer since Dominic Cummings departed. COVID is still raging out of control again, but vaccines still offer hope on the horizon, and there are ominous signs of an emerging political strategy to strangle any Labour recovery at birth. The redrawing of constituency boundaries, which again we've talked about before on this channel, and making a Tory general election victory easier is back on the agenda. Rishi Sunak is raining money on red wall seats in a suspiciously targeted fashion, and while Labour will say it's too little too late, a Conservative party willing to spend is a new and disconcerting enemy. Some MPs have begun to fear that their new leader is a nice guy, but is no match for an opponent willing to play dirty and running out time to define himself. Keir Starmer ends the year less on a high than on a plateau. We'll soon know if his ultimate flight path is upwards or plummeting back down to earth. And I completely agree. Starmer's got to define himself. He really does. This is why I've said he's got to start putting out policies. He's got to start defining what that Labour Britain really is and what victory means if Labour win. He has to start doing that. And as we've said there, yeah, Rishi Sunak is going out and very targetedly dropping money here, left, right and centre, but it's only in the seats where they think they can win. And May's local elections are going to be huge. Make no mistake. I'm hoping that, to be honest, the Tories do not make any significant gains, and that some of these seats do not go to the Tories, because I worry that this is a plan, that they want to win these local elections, and then with a Tory MP as well, they can start to really, and I mean really, put some serious austerity on these northern towns in the likes we haven't seen for quite some time. Because one of the things that is stopping a lot of these, and really worrying, shall we say, a lot, and I mean a lot of these Tory MPs, is the fact that they are sitting on top of Labour-run councils and districts. And they are worried that that machine below them is what will kick them out. And they do have a right to be worried, but we should worry about that redistricting. Because how is it fair to make Tories easier to win and Tory seats easier to win? This is completely unfair. It goes beyond this. This is why I've said we need to reform our voting system. This is one of the things that Starmer should be doing, but he's not. And it's so frustrating. so frustrating to see this going on right before our eyes. And the problem is, at the next general election, because the Tories have redrawn those redistricting lines, we may see some red seats, or what these red wall seats, become blue seats again because the Tories drew the lines in such a way that it allowed them to win. And that really is the worrying thing going forward. It really, really is. And of course, hopefully, the that will not pass. But unfortunately, I very think that it very much will, because the Tories have a massive majority at this point, and like I say, it doesn't matter if all the other parties oppose it. They can just do what they want with that massive majority, which is what we really have to worry about going forward, because the Tories can do whatever the hell they want, and the only thing that seems to stop them is a massive public outcry. And once again, I really do hope this generates a massive public outcry, because quite frankly, the question should be asked: if the Tories are allowed to redraw these maps, especially to win, should these not be then given to an or created a new organisation that is independent from the government, that for them to draw their own maps? Again, this is part of something that Starmer should be voting for: a complete overhaul of our voting system. And one thing I basically say is, forget our current system. Let's just bring in a completely new system and push heavily for PR. So if, like me, you do believe that proportional representation is the way to go forward, I urge you, do go join the Labour for PR movement. Or if you don't know what PR is, or proportional representation is, and why it's such a good thing, then go to their website. They have a fantastic frequently asked questions section, and that will fill you all in. And again, I urge you, go check it out for yourself. So, thanks for watching. Please remember to hit that like and share button. And of course, down below there's a link to my Patreon page and a One Up Nation link. And thank you very much to the people who do support me that way. And as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.